Hello, everyone. Good morning from Austin, Texas. I'm very excited to be a part of this panel, and I'm sorry for not being able to be there in person. Today, I'm going to talk about the Eastern Mediterranean during and after the First World War, and I'm going to discuss some ecological dimensions of the war and its consequences. Now, we tend to think of the First World War as a political threshold in the history of the region, as the one moment where the region went from a world of empires, more specifically the Ottoman Empire, to a world of first mandate states under either French or British mandates, and later on to a world of decolonization and nation states. But the war was also an ecological threshold. And it was an ecological threshold in the sense that it was a moment of abrupt change, and I'm borrowing Groffman's definition of ecological threshold here. It was a moment of abrupt change, both in the quality of the system, but perhaps more importantly in the way people thought about their connection to the land. And maybe the best way to grasp the magnitude of this change is to start the story where it ends, and it ends during the 1930s. This is a 1935 cover from a journal called الاقتصاديات العربية, Arab Economies. And what we see here are nations, people defining themselves not only by these borders, these national borders on the map, but through their connection to the land, through their ability to extract both the value, economical value, and meaning from the land. So people are defining themselves by their connection to agriculture. We see here citrus in mandatory Palestine, cotton in Egypt, cedar in Lebanon, dates in Iraq. These are all expression to sovereignty through agriculture. But that sovereignty, that ability of people to imagine themselves through, again, their connection to the land, began with the war, and it began with a tragedy. So the story I'm going to tell you today has two parts. The first is a story about an ecological tragedy that unfolded during the war. And the second part is a story about hope, about how people were able to lift themselves from the tragedy of the war and start defining themselves by, in a way, that same tragedy that they experienced only a few years before. All right, so let's begin with the first part, the story about tragedy. And it begins in the late 19th century, where local economies, as we know from other places around the world, are being absorbed or incorporated into global capitalist markets, right? And there is a shift in local production from satisfying local needs to answering foreign wants. Local economies begin to reorient themselves toward export of cash crops like cotton in Egypt, dates in Iraq, figs and grapes in Anatolia, and citrus in Palestine. These are all becoming global commodities that are supported by foreign capital that encourages the creation of cash crop economies. What we see here is a great example for that change. It's a picture from Lebanon, where the silk industry was highly important, and where by the late 19th century, some 80% of the cultivated land was devoted to mulberry trees that were crucial for that industry, for the silk industry. So at the eve of the war, local economies, local agroecosystems, are in a way already unable to support local needs, the needs of local population. And then as the war breaks, there's once again a major transformation, and a very abrupt transformation in the way people interact with their agroecosystems. And it is a change that revolves around their ability to extract not value, but meanings from the land. So first of all, as the war breaks, there is a global halt in trade, which leads to economic disorientation around the region. So if I'm a citrus farmer in Palestine, all of a sudden I don't know what to do with all the citrus that I'm farming, because I can't ship them to Europe. There is also a labor shortage because both the British army in Egypt and the Ottoman army in what is today Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan both implement conscriptions of both young men and horses, camels, and donkeys to support the war effort. And there is a huge labor shortage, and lands are being under-cultivated, if you can call it that way. What we see in these pictures are Ottoman armies, more specifically Ottoman Camel Transport Corps. In addition to all that, there is a huge resource allocation towards the fighting forces. Like in the picture that we see here of a field bakery next to Gaza, local resources that, if you remember, in the late 19th century were oriented to foreign ones, are now reoriented to support either the British army or the Ottoman army. On top of that, nature shaped how people experienced the war. So there is a series of droughts in Lebanon and Palestine and floods in southern Iraq that hurt local cultivation. There is also a regional wave of desert locust, which I won't even try to pronounce, won't even pretend to know how to pronounce its Latin name, that swept through the region from 1914 to 1916 and destroys whatever is left from what the armies didn't take for themselves. The result of all the above is an ecological catastrophe and one of the most severe famines that the region ever experienced. I want to stick to the numbers here because they are horrifying. So in Egypt, some 200,000 people, roughly 1.6% of the population, perished because of hunger and related disease. In Greater Syria, some estimations talk about 11 to 16% of the population that died as a result of wartime famine. So the war was a moment of an ecological collapse of local agro-ecosystems. How do we get from such a devastating picture to such a hopeful depiction of the region? The story of how the region redeemed itself through agriculture, which I'm not the first one to tell, by the way. Elizabeth Williams wrote a wonderful dissertation about post-war Syria. So the story of that redemption leans on three main pillars. First, our colonial policies and aspirations to reorganize nature. Second, our national aspirations to rejuvenate the nation through agriculture in the post-colonial era. And then the third is an attempt to reframe nature as a mechanism to achieve both surplus value and both political goals. Now, instead of focusing on one specific location, I want to use one commodity, date palms, to explore how two different communities used that crop, that tree, to redeem themselves from the catastrophe of the war. So let's start with Iraq. And we begin again in the late 19th century. So in the late 19th century, dates are considered the most important export sector in Iraq. They are exported mostly from here, from southern Iraq, area known as Shatt al-Arab, to India, to the UK, to the US, and they're a big part of local economy. As the war ends, the British initiate a mandate over Iraq, and Iraqi policymakers, with the encouragement of British officials, decide to further capitalize on the economic ability of these trees. From roughly 10 to 20 million trees at the end of the 19th century, Iraq has some 30 million trees in 1926. These 30 million trees make up to roughly a third of the global inventory. So a third of the dates that are cultivated around the world are in Iraq at this point. And after Iraq gains independence in 1932, the government issues laws and decrees to regulate date production and trade, and in a way it executes its sovereignty through agriculture. So in Iraq, the decision was to redeem themselves through agriculture by going all in on dates. In mandatory Palestine, the picture is a bit different. Some communities there use dates a bit differently. All right, let's go back to the end of the 19th century. So before the war, dates are cultivated in Ottoman Palestine for local consumption. They're not a major export sector. And Zionist communities there, Zionist settlers there, don't really care about dates. They're more interested in either citrus cultivation for export or grain cultivation for local consumption. Yet after the war ended and witnessing the ecological catastrophe that it caused, some Zionist activists decide to use dates to what I call diversify their portfolio. One of those activists was Joseph Weitz, who was a horticulturalist from the Department of Agriculture Settlement of the Jewish Organization. And Weitz goes to Egypt in 1921 to learn about how dates are cultivated there. And he returns to mandatory Palestine and writes this report. And what the report does is that it reframes people's relationship with that one crop, with dates. It is a crop that they already knew, but it reframes how people should think about it. So it makes it from a passive object in an unproductive landscape to a political tool, to a mechanism to extract value from the ground, but also to extract meaning for the emerging and developing Zionist national project in mandatory Palestine. And this reframing is done through three main conclusions that the report presents. The first one is that local dates that are already grown in mandatory Palestine, are of poor quality, and there is a need to import better varieties to mandatory Palestine. Now, if it resonates to anyone with Zionist political thought about the local landscape or the local population, I don't think it is no coincidence. You can see here, this is a picture from the report, and we can see why it's believed that local dates are not as good as important ones. You can see the ratio here between the flesh and the the pit in the local dates, and the flesh and the pit in the foreign dates right here. So again, first conclusion, we need to import dates from other places. The second conclusion is that redemption through agriculture is possible because it was done in the past. Weitz looks at California, where a thriving date sector was already on the go. And he concludes that, again, this redemption, this creating this new industry for the national project is indeed doable. And then the third conclusion is that this new project, this new Zionist date project, is to be a hybrid creation of East and West. So contrary to other cases of colonial agriculture that tend to overlook the experience of local practices, Weitz calls to learn from neighboring Egypt and Iraq and to learn from both their experience and the experience of California to establish this new Zionist enterprise. All right, so to wrap everything that I've covered today, the war was an ecological threshold. It was a moment of ecological catastrophe that forced people to rethink their connection to the land, that forced people to rethink not only how they extract value from the land, but how they extract meaning, and especially national meaning in a decolonial, in a post-colonial world. In light of the recent horrifying developments in Ukraine and the unfolding environmental catastrophe that is happening there, I think the least I can do with this presentation is offering a message of hope, and letting people know that redemption through agriculture and rejuvenation after an ecological disaster is indeed an option. And that's it for me. I'm waiting to hear your questions. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.